Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to speak to you this afternoon. The title of my talk is indeed Making Science Work. That is, how can we make science work well? In particular, how can we make good decisions about what scientific research should be supported for the public good? And by the term public good, I mean it in the widest possible sense, covering the contributions that science makes to our culture and to the applications of science that benefits society, such as improving our health and quality of life, securing sustainability and protection of the environment, driving innovation to support the economy. But today my main focus will be on research leading to applications of science. But before I begin that, I think it's always important to remember that scientific knowledge leads to better understanding of ourselves and of the natural world, and that is an essential part of our civilization, in this respect, like the humanities. So we shouldn't simply judge science solely in a utilitarian manner. And this was emphasized very nicely by the American physicist Robert Wilson, who, when questioned by Congress as to how the Fermilab particle accelerator, that was a precursor of CERN, when questioned about how that accelerator would help national security by Congress, he answered, "It has nothing to do directly with defending our country, except to make it worth defending." And I think that's something we should always bear in mind when we are thinking, as I will do mainly today, about applications. Now, the discovery of new scientific knowledge and the application of scientific knowledge, sometimes these are presented as being very different from each other. However, scientific inquiry has often, nearly always been concerned both with acquiring knowledge of the natural world and ourselves, and with using that knowledge for the public good. Francis Bacon, really the first scientific philosopher beginning of the 17th century, argued that science improves learning and knowledge and leads to the relief of man's estate. And this was an argument reinforced by Robert Hooke at the birth of the Royal Society, who emphasized that scientific discoveries, and this is what he was interested in at the time, concerning motion, light, gravity, magnetism, and the heavens, help to improve shipping, watches, optics, and engines for trade and carriage. I like engines for trade and carriage. Now, there's a continuum from what I prefer to call discovery science rather than basic science, from discovery science, acquiring new knowledge, through research aimed at translating scientific knowledge for application, and then on to innovation. And this continuum, this spectrum, should be considered as, in my view, as an interactive ecosystem, with knowledge generated at different places within that continuum, influencing both upstream in the creation of new discoveries and downstream in the production of new applications. Now, a historic example of how investigations downstream can influence research upstream was work on improving the steam engine, which greatly informed the subsequent formulation of thermodynamics. So it's important to emphasize this continuum of science. Investing too heavily in a particular part of that spectrum, or placing barriers in that spectrum, or arguing that different parts of the ecosystem are superior to other parts, all of which I have sometimes heard, should all be rejected. Science throughout that continuum shares the same values, the same skill sets and methodologies, and although I'll discuss later, although there can be differences in emphasis in how the research is carried out. Now, what factors have to be considered when deciding what scientific research should be supported? And this is something I want to really focus on today. Now, for me, the really crucial issue is the scientist carrying out that research. Major discoveries in science are usually associated with highly talented individuals who combine a number of qualities. They have in-depth knowledge, they are creative, they understand the values of science and how research is done, they are well motivated, and they are effective in achieving what they wish to do. And I'm going to touch on some of these different aspects. Now, in-depth knowledge of an area of science is essential, obviously, but this does need to be combined with what John Cadogan has called peripheral vision. That is an understanding and openness to what other sciences, not your main interest, what other sciences can contribute. And this is especially required when solution of a research problem needs multidisciplinary approaches, often the case when science is close to application. Now, carrying out good scientific research is a creative activity, and scientists have more similarities than might be imagined with those pursuing other creative activities such as the arts and the media. Like other creative workers, scientists thrive on freedom, and frankly, organising them is like herding cats. In other words, more or less impossible. Freedom of thought, to pursue a line of investigation wherever it may lead, and to uncover, if necessary, uncomfortable truths are all crucial to an effective scientific endeavour. A scientist whose thoughts are restrained, who is too strongly directed, or who is unable to freely exchange ideas will not be an effective scientist. Similarly, and this is important, societies that are not free and do not encourage the free exchange of ideas or respect the values of science cannot easily be leading scientific powers, because that freedom is closely connected with the creativity required for good science. And I stress this because of emerging countries in science have to understand the importance of freedom for good science. Now, good scientists have to embrace the values of science, have respect for reliable and reproducible data, to embrace a skeptical approach which challenges orthodoxy, and particularly the scientist's own ideas, abhor the falsification or cherry-picking of data, and be committed to the pursuit of truth. Scientific research is hard, and to be effective, research scientists need to be highly motivated. Often this motivation is provided by a passionate curiosity about the natural world, a desire to know how things work or how they can be directed to achieve particular outcomes. But other motivations are also important. For example, a desire to undertake public good through the eradication of disease, for example, to make something useful, to create economic wealth, or even to become rich and famous. Not that many of us either become rich or famous who are scientists. But whatever the motivation, it needs to be strong, because the pursuit of research is long and it is difficult. So in deciding what research should be supported, in my view, much attention should be paid to the scientists carrying out that research. And as far as possible, decision about research projects should be closely associated with assessments of the individuals proposing those projects. Now, given this emphasis I'm giving on the primacy of the individuals, decisions should be guided by the effectiveness of the researchers making the research proposal. And the most useful criterion is immediate past success. Those that have recently carried out high-quality research are most likely to continue to do so, at least in the short to medium term. So in coming to research funding decisions, the objective is not to simply support those that write good quality grant proposals, but to support those that will carry out good quality research. It's obvious, but it's something our research councils need to pay attention to. Attention needs to be given to actual performance rather than planned potential activity. Now, obviously, such an emphasis needs to be tempered for those who have only a limited recent past record, such as early career researchers, or those who have had a break in their careers. And in these cases, making more use of face-to-face interviews can be very helpful in determining the quality of the researcher making the application. The greater costs involved in direct interviews are more than compensated by the greater quality of the decisions that are then made. Looking at somebody, you know, the whites of their eyes, I can tell you, is a really good way to sort out the bullshit. It really, really is. So making good decisions about research funding requires a focus on quality, passion and past performance of the scientist proposing the research. Now, a perennially vexing question is how prescriptive research funding agencies should be in determining what research areas should be supported. Incidentally, I now know I'm entering a minefield, just in case you think that I don't. Now, this is a recurring issue which arises because of the tensions between scientists who want the freedom to decide what they should pursue and society which supports science not simply as a cultural activity, increasing knowledge, but also as an activity aimed at improving the lot of humankind through achieving specific useful objectives. There's a tension there. Now, one possible response that funding agencies face with this issue is to carry out a strategic review to decide priorities and identify research areas judged either as being especially timely for advances or reflecting particular needs for society. And this can lead to initiatives that shape or sponsor research, I'm using my words carefully, and sometimes with ring-fenced allocations of research funding. Now, although this is often well-intentioned and it can be useful, these approaches are risky, and they're risky because they can waste money and they run the risk of funding lower quality of research. And as this isn't always immediately obvious, I want to explain why. One problem, relevant to what I've already said, is that by ring-fencing funding and shaping funding, decisions are separated from consideration both together of the specific projects and the scientists carrying out that project, because you're making it distant from that decision-making. And as a consequence, such initiatives may attract less creative and effective scientists who are simply following where resources are being made available. In other words, it doesn't encourage getting the best scientists involved in the problem you want to deal with. A second problem is that the identification of favoured and non-favoured research areas is usually made up by committees made up of what I call silverback senior researchers. I'm a silverback senior researcher. Sometimes not particularly research active anymore themselves, and such committees are prone to coming up with the rather obvious and being behind the cutting edge. Better judgments, in my view, are more likely to be made by scientists actually carrying out or close to carrying out specific areas of research who are much closer to the research problem being pursued. I read these strategies, yet they are so obvious most of the time, it makes me weep. Okay? It just makes me weep. But we still have our tension. How can we resolve this tension between societal needs and the creativity of the scientists? Well, I don't have a complete answer, but I think there's three issues that I'd like to talk about. The first is the Haldane principle, or rather what we understand the Haldane principle to be. The second is a different approach when considering programs aimed at achieving applications and specific goals. And thirdly, a more imaginative role for scientific leadership in influencing funding. And I want to consider each of those three. Now, the Haldane principle is usually interpreted as meaning that researchers and not politicians should decide how to spend funds, although the original Haldane report, incidentally, made actually no reference to a specific principle. It's sort of just grown up somehow. David Willetts, our science minister, has recently expressed his understanding of that principle as meaning that politicians informed by external advice should decide on the overall science budget and allocation between research councils, actually quite a difficult thing to do, along with identifying specific challenges or key infrastructures, but should not be involved in decisions on specific funding proposals which should be made by researchers. Now, this is a sensible view, but I want to actually extend it a little further by arguing more generally that decisions should be made as close as possible to the researchers actually carrying out the research. Now, such thinking can be extended to decision makers further down the funding chain from politicians into, for example, the research councils. those leading research funding bodies should focus their attention on high-level priorities and avoid the temptation to becoming too prescriptive and finely grained in recommendations concerning areas to be funded. This should be left to those closer to the research who are more likely to make sensible decisions. If it sounds as if I'm talking about EPSRC, I am talking about EPSRC, and I am talking about other research councils who get tempted in this direction too. Now, I'm going to illustrate this point by using a metaphor derived from geographical exploration. In the 19th century, the Royal Geographical Society, based in London, might decide to support an expedition of a particular area on the planet, like the Amazon basin, the source of the Nile, or the Antarctic. But it will be ill-advised if it tries to be too fine-grained in its deliberations and specify which Amazon tributary, or African lake, or South Polar glacier should be the focus of attention. That should be left, obviously, to the explorer on the ground, not those sitting in offices in London. The funder's role should be to define the general geographical region of interest, identify the best explorer, and then properly equip that explorer so they can be most effective in the field. My view is research funders should behave generally in much the same way. They should put their trust most in the explorer scientist carrying out the research rather than in a committee in London or in Swindon, for that matter. As far as possible, research funding decisions, especially at the discovery end of the research spectrum, should be driven by the scientists carrying out that research because they are the best ones placed to shape the research agenda. That's the reason why response mode funding is in fact rather effective at discovering new scientific knowledge. Having said that, this approach does need modification when a research program is directed at achieving a very specific goal or application, which does sometimes happen, of course, and that requires more prescriptive behaviour. Goal-directed research, however, can occur anywhere in that scientific spectrum. It tends to be more prevalent when thinking about applications, but it can occur elsewhere. It is necessary in those circumstances and valuable to identify sectors which are close to application as being areas that are worth supporting. However, identification of sectors worthy of support should be still rather broadly scoped and involve both those carrying out the research and those who want to use the outcomes of that research. You need to cross that boundary. I think, on the whole, that should generally involve some financial contribution from those wanting to exploit the research, because it means they put their money where their mouth is. So I think that, in fact, helps concentrate their minds. Now, this more prescriptive approach, which we sometimes have to do, applies to research close to application across the whole spectrum. But it also applies for not-for-profit activities, such as improving health and protecting the environment. But even when decisions are more prescriptive, they need to be driven by quality, both of the research and of the researcher. I want to make two further points, which I've already hinted at. The first is that not all research close to application should be prescriptive. There's an important role for bottom-up response mode funding in the translation and innovation parts of the spectrum. And the second is the fact that more prescriptive approaches are obviously required sometimes at the discovery end of research, for example, when assembling large data sets such as genome sequences or meteorological data, or when investing in large infrastructures such as particle accelerators or telescopes. That does have to be prescriptive. And the real point I'm making here is that we can't have a one-size-glove-fits-all. And sometimes research funding agencies just treat it all the same. I'm going to come back to that a little later. And they don't fully realise that you have to have different approaches depending on quite what you're trying to achieve. The third issue was the one of scientific leadership, what scientific leaders can put into this. Now, if after getting good advice from those close to research, a research funding leader, such as the leader of a research council, decides that a particular research area is important, My advice to them is, rather than ring-fencing resources, what they should consider is undertaking a process of education and inspiration so that researchers in the field become motivated to work in that area. In short, that they should be showing leadership rather than prescription. Now, should that area really be as promising as the research leader thinks, then of course it's relatively easy to persuade high-quality scientists there's something interesting to be done, and they will submit proposals in the normal response mode system. Should it not be so interesting, then high-quality researchers will be less impressed and less likely to be persuaded to submit proposals. Leadership, in other words. In this case, maybe the research leader should perhaps think again whether his or her enthusiasm is well placed. Research leaders do need to be proactive, but in my view, not by ring-fencing or micromanagement of the research agenda, but by educating and inspiring the research community. We need inspirational leaders at the heads of our research funding organisations. We do not want managers. We want inspirational leaders. We do not want managers. We can get managers in other ways. I mean, I'm a manager. It's not I don't value it. We need inspirational leaders. Now, are there any other special features concerning decision-making with respect to science closer to application? Science across the whole continuum shares many similarities, and this includes the importance of supporting talented individuals with the ability and passion to get the job done, as I've already mentioned. However, work closer to application is also more likely to be multidisciplinary. It may well require greater teamwork, covering more scientific disciplines than more discovery science, and also activities outside science, finance, market analysis, and the law. All of this are important when you're close to application. Now, it requires a lot of effort to get individuals from such diverse backgrounds to work well together. And attention needs to be paid to encouraging mutual respect and to break down barriers between individuals from different backgrounds. And this would be encouraged if there was much greater permeability between sectors, encouraging the transfer of both ideas and people more freely. I feel we have a problem because we have in place too many barriers and silos that inhibit free transfer and encourage suspicion even between the very people that need to work closely together. Now, I think this has arisen because one of the problems is the increasing knowledge, and scientific knowledge is increasing dramatically, has led to specialization, making interactions between different scientists difficult, and interactions between scientists, industry, and the public services and other professions also more difficult. And I think we can learn a lesson by looking backwards to times of less complex society, such as those at the time of the Industrial Revolution. Take the Lunar Society, for example, made up of chemists, biologists, doctors, industrialists, engineers, social reformers, entrepreneurs. They regularly met every month to talk and to exchange ideas. They included intellectuals and entrepreneurs such as James Watt, Josiah Wedgwood, Matthew Boulton, and Erasmus Darwin. They met together in the Midlands, notice, outside London, not in Oxford, not in Cambridge, in the Midlands, once a month, under the full moon. I think they had a nickname, the Lunatics, as a consequence of that, which illuminated them during their ride home after dinner. This was the late 18th century. They'd probably had too much wine, too, by that stage as well. Now, it was in this atmosphere that the Industrial Revolution was nurtured. And we need to think about how it can be reproduced today. We need greater permeability, promoting interaction, starting, in fact, in our universities, I think, promoting contacts between different disciplines, which allow wider intellectual exposure during education and research training. There need to be more diverse placements early in careers, with easy exchanges between sectors at all career stages. And this is a really key message I want to make. The promotion of translation and innovation for the public good requires much better permeability across sectors. Much is spoken about what is called the Valley of Death. The Valley of Death is the gap between the generation of new knowledge and the application of that new knowledge, particularly for commercialisation. And it's thought to be a valley that's extremely difficult to cross. Now, usually the focus of the discussion here, I think, is somewhat misplaced because it focuses on providing resources, finance, to bridge that gap. And although that obviously has a role, I think part of the problem is that we need to pay greater attention to other issues. And if I can continue the metaphor of the Valley of Death, in particular in pushing the bridgeheads out from both sides of the valley, both from the discovery end of research and also from industry or those wanting to use applications. There can be a problem when attempts to translate are made too prematurely before the knowledge is sufficiently reliable. That's especially a problem in the biosciences, which are complex. And if you have a goal fixed too early in a particular direction, and then you find that the research starts taking you over here, if you've raised money or support, or your brain has tuned in simply to reaching that goal, then you start wasting money because you're still trying to go here when actually reality is taking you over here. In discovery science, we deal with that all the time. In translation, you're trying to reach an objective, and if it's too early, that leads to real problems. If we will forgive the pun and thinking of the film of a similar name, to rush into translation runs the risk of becoming lost in translation. And that certainly occurs. Now, therefore, I'm arguing a firmer bridgeheads need to be built, involving a more extended and secure knowledge base in the area of interest before attempting to pass over the Valley of Death and become more goal-directed. But similarly, the bridgehead on the other side of the valley needs to be extended out, with more investment from industry in research aimed at capturing new knowledge from the other side of the valley. And what troubles me when industry de-skills in this area is that without research capacity and knowledge in industry, it is difficult to build back over that valley of death. You can't recognize a good idea when there's one there. So we have to pay attention to both sides of the valley. Now, I need to say something about impact. The first thing is just to sort of understand what we mean by impact, because all researchers want their research to have impact in the sense of the word. I don't do research that has no impact. Of course we want to have impact. That impact could be to increase knowledge, it could be to contribute to culture, it could be to generate societal benefit, it could be to support the economy. Where I think the issue has become difficult is, and where the problems come from, is when naive and crude metrical applications of impact are made an obligatory part of research funding decisions and assessments. The potential impact of a piece of research should obviously be clearly identified if it makes sense to do so. But it does not always make sense to do so. And to demand a statement in every research proposal or assessment, as we often do, about impact for societal or economic benefit, will often simply result in unhelpful flights of fantasy of no or very limited value. Impact is one aspect out of a number of factors that need to be considered when assessing a research proposal and should be provided when relevant and not at all if irrelevant. I do not understand how our research councils don't understand this. I just do not. It is so obvious, you know. 5-year-olds should get it, really. So how can we make sure that science works well and thrives in the United Kingdom, and how it can continue to bring benefits to our economy? Well, the first requirement is, of course, to have a high-quality science base. We are very good at science in the UK. We have been, in fact, for centuries. I don't actually quite know why, to be honest, but we are. Britain played a major role in founding modern science and also its applications for public good through the efforts of the Royal Society and the Industrial Revolution. We do not need to create world-class science in our country, that we already have, but we do need to maintain, cherish and encourage our scientific endeavour and to promote its use for the public good. So we have to recognise we have something good, but we have to protect it. Now, many features important for good science are well embedded in the UK. We have a tradition of respect for empiricism. We emphasise reliable observation and experiment. Science in the UK is carried out mostly in a culture of openness and freedom. And scientists need to express freely their doubts and to be sceptical, as I've already argued. They also should not be too strongly directed from the top, stifling creativity. We have to keep a spirit of adventure in science, to take risks and be prepared sometimes to fail, as research at the cutting edge, as I know absolutely to my own experience, is often not successful. For science to flourish, a broad portfolio of investments required. Funding should be across that entire continuum that I've already discussed. Research often needs a longer timescale than is usual, with the more short-term priorities that private business wanting to make money, or for that matter politicians elected on a 5-year cycle, are comfortable with. So this can cause problems with long-term projects such as translating scientific advances into applications. But the short-term pressures from commerce and politicians in bridging those short-term pressures with the longer times required to develop discovery research into effective application is crucial. Now, I'm not sure how to deal with this, but I think greater collaboration between publicly funded research and private companies may help reduce the risk and move science to application. One thing I'm actually particularly interested in, and I don't have time to explain it fully here, is that increasingly, for example, pharmaceutical companies will have very directed trials. And because they're aiming at a particular objective, and that's partly because of the regulatory environment in which they work, but partly because it's so expensive. If you added on to such a trial NHS funding which explores the use of that trial to find out many other things, like biomarkers and so on, what you will do is discover other things that you didn't know about. The obvious example I always use here is that the discovery of Viagra had nothing to do with knowledge-based science. It was a complete accident. It was being developed for heart disease. If it wasn't for the fact the side effects were so obvious that they couldn't be missed, then we would not have that drug and its use for application. Now, that is sold as a success story. It's actually a story that tells us why we are failing, because we do not know enough about what is going on in complex organisms such as ourselves, and we should be using trials as research tools and not simply to justify a particular objective. Now, the UK is good at science, as I've said, but we cannot rest on our laurels. Excellent scientific research requires talent. We need to attract the most accomplished scientists in the world to come here. They do want to come here because we do have high quality. And that means that the necessity to attract highly trained scientists from abroad has to be reflected in the UK's immigration policy. I'll say no more about it, but that's obvious. We have to be an attractive place for talented scientists from overseas. Our citizens also need an education that allows them to fully participate in a democracy that will increasingly require engagement with scientific matters. Now, teaching should be of a quality such that pupils with the talent and inclination to become scientists are inspired to do so, but in addition, those that don't, the vast majority, have to know about science. They have to know what it is. And it's going to be difficult to have good teaching in schools if, as is the case now, nearly all our primary school teachers, over a quarter of chemistry teachers, and nearly a third of physics teachers have no specialist qualifications in the appropriate science. This is a disgrace. We cannot let that continue. There also needs to be more attention on practical science in schools, including, I think, particularly natural history, or the natural laboratory out there, reinforcing the fact that science is built on observation and experiment. Pupils must be inspired by the wonders of science and need to understand why science generates reliable knowledge. They shouldn't just be stuffed with facts. They have to be stuffed with the knowledge that these facts have been developed from a process that is very reliable. At the very least, everyone leaving school with Arthur sitting there in the audience, everyone leaving school should know the difference between astronomy and astrology. And I tell you, 50% of the population do not. And if we just teach science as received wisdom, they will treat astronomy and astrology as the same thing. Why don't you believe, astrology in the Daily Mail? Well, I know we don't believe anything else in the Daily Mail, but I mean, that's not beside the point. You mustn't take that away. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. There are too many barriers between scientists and technologists and engineers, and there are further blocks between those communities and those who lead public services and industry who need science. And it's essential to break down those barriers, going back to permeability of ideas and people. With permeability and greater mutual respect will become more innovative ideas. We need to translate science into useful applications. So I want to now end my talk because I think that at this point, because I think that good science is crucial for us all, for our culture, our health, our quality of life, for protecting our environment, for our economy. And getting science to work well for us will become increasingly important for our society. And I will argue that making these proper decisions about science and the uses of science is so important that it's actually key for maintaining the health of our democracy as well as the public good. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. I can only hope that the right policymakers hear that as well, and we shall make sure they do. Thank you, Paul. We have time for a couple of brief questions, if anyone's got one. Veronica.
Paul, thank you so much. I had to actually make myself sit still. It was so exciting when you talked about the permeability between disciplinary areas. And it's very heartwarming because, as you know, here in Durham, we try very hard to ensure permeability right across the disciplines. So I wondered if I could ask you just to say a word or two about reaching further afield beyond the sciences to the arts, humanities and social sciences.
Yes, so I'll say two things. One is that permeability has to extend also beyond our academic disciplines in engagement with society and the public generally. And I didn't emphasise that, and I know that was out with your question, but I do want to emphasise that because we shouldn't take it for granted that scientists will... I stole this from a House of Lords report from 10 years ago. We have to earn our licence to operate, and we have to keep that licence to operate, and because society pays us, and if we're going to use science in the best possible ways, we have to ensure there's a comfortable relationship between scientists and the public, and that happens through engagement. The point you mentioned about engagement with the other academic disciplines, the humanities and social sciences. The social sciences are, of course, part of science, and they are crucial whenever you're thinking about applications for societal good. And indeed, half our reports that we do from the Royal Society have social scientists on them for that particular reason. But the humanities are important also, and I think this is the point that you are probably wanting to make, because the sciences and humanities are all part of our civilization, of developing the intellectual excitement around understanding ourselves and the world better. They are all part of the same piece. And so we do need to be able to we will gain from those interactions in all sorts of ways. And so the permeability has to be academic as well as across into society too.
Arnold, as long as you don't explain the difference between astrology and astronomy.
Do you know the difference, Arnold?
Paul, you'll be surprised to learn that I agree with everything you said.
No, I'm very surprised. I've never known you ever to say that, ever, to anybody. No.
Can I take some of the strands and weave them together in a rather serious way? You mentioned the public understanding of science. 20 years ago, I chaired a government committee, Cabinet Office Committee, on this topic, as you may remember.
Yes.
And we made the point rather strongly that everyone, all scientists in receipt of public money, have a duty to explain science of some sort to the public, or to try. Now, if we consider your area, for example, as you well know, there are as many cells in the human brain as there are stars in the galaxy. That may be a religious point, but it's a fact. Now, do you think, seriously, that time has come where every researcher should have a responsibility, to some extent, to think of some application of his or her technique to the betterment of the human race?
Well, what I think is covering a couple of different things that you said there. First of all, communication with the public. 2 points there. The first is engagement is more than communicating one way. It is also listening to the public to know what the issues are, in fact, a proper dialogue. And the reason I emphasize that, because we had such a debacle over discussion, for example, of GM crops. I was involved in sort of a post-mortem there and found that the public, one of the reasons they didn't like GM crops was because the food had genes in it. And that wasn't anything that a scientist would ever think of, you know. I'm not blaming the public for thinking that, I'm blaming us for not knowing that they wanted that actually explained. So I think engagement, the two-way dialogue is important. In communicating to the public, we do have to recognise that not everybody's good at it, you know. I think there's nothing more painful than seeing somebody making a mess of it, to be quite honest. So I think that everybody should take it seriously, but we can't expect people who are no good at it to be any good at it. But what's really important is that when you do have somebody who's good at it, they need to be encouraged. And what bothers me is when you get you know, academics are such snobs half the time. You know, the snobbery, you get somebody out on telly who's talking about something and you'll hear it, you know, in the common room the next day. Well, he made a mistake there and he didn't quite say that there. If you've ever been in front of a camera trying to do anything, it's very, very, very difficult. And when somebody is decent at it, they should really be encouraged. I also think that and this isn't quite the same thing as you were saying, but I think we have to recognise when we are getting support for our science, we are in a privileged position. I don't think we always we think it's almost a right. I feel privileged to have been supported all my life, and I feel that I have to make a case for it in my own head. I feel that unless I'm doing something I think is really important, I would do something else, and I would try and use my skills sets in another way that might be for more useful applications. I mean, so my way of answering it's not quite the same way. I've done discovery research. As long as it's of a high quality, I feel it was worth doing, you know? If I felt it wasn't of the really high quality, then I'd rather do something more useful. I'm not saying that isn't hard too, but when you're really at a cutting edge, it's really, really difficult. So it's in the same area, but not quite the same point. Maybe one more?
One more, and then yes, gentleman back there.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I have an interesting question about, just mentioned why Britain became the leaders in scientific research and why the industrial revolutions happened in Britain.
Yeah.
It just mentioned that maybe it's because some intelligent people meet together when they were in school. I think that's part of the reason. I still read some articles about this. I have already been thinking about this issue because there is a real article written by a professor in Stanford University. His point is more about the locations. He compared West and Britain and East, that's China. In China, the structure of economies mainly depends on agriculture, and for agriculture depends on the weather. If you want to have a good harvest, you just you can just make sure you have good weather, and you want to have good weather, you look at the past, based on your past experience. So for people in China, there is no incentive for looking at the future or innovation just based on the past. And for Britain, the economy depends on international trade, and for a good international trade, you have to tame the ocean, and the ocean is changing, ocean is dangerous, so you must have advanced technology, build a modern aviation system to guarantee that you have a successful trade. So that's the point of view of the professor, and I want to know what your opinion about that.
Well, so this sure. This question takes an hour to answer, as I'm sure you appreciate, and we have to depart in 5 minutes. I quite like the idea that we're good at science in Britain because we have bad weather, though. And given that, I think Durham should be really the absolute centre of high-quality science if today's experience is anything to go by. I think it is interesting. I think complacency does lead to a lack of stretching out, and that's a little bit what you're saying. And the Industrial Revolution was partly, I'm sure, we were agriculturally never a very strong country compared with France and Italy and so on. We did have to look overseas, we did have to look at other things. Of course, the historians of the Industrial Revolution will point to the fact that you could find coal and iron ore in the same place with water power if you go to Iron Bridge. So, I mean, there's obviously those sorts of factors that are very important. But I do think there is something about the culture which reflects a respect for empiricism. That is a focus on observation and experiment. We do have theory, of course we had Newton, but we also, it's based very much on observation and experiment. I do think fundamentally we've had quite a free and liberal society over many years. I think that is another crucial point. There's a third one, which is to do with practicality. You know, scientists are artisans. It's an intellectual activity, but it's also, you're doing stuff with your hands often. And that has worked in Britain. I don't fully understand that because, you know, there's always, the working with hands, there's this class distinction. But in China, as you know, the intellectuals would never work with their hands. And I think that's another damaging factor. I don't really know the reason, but I know it works, and since it works and it's one of the big things that we do well in this country, we should damn well support it properly and work out how we can drive innovation so we can get it to work. But the science itself is good and we should support it, and then I'm going to stop. Okay?